here is an n8n workflow, and here is the Notion API. I'm going through each node available in n8n and looking at what it corresponds to in the Notion API documentation here, what endpoint that is using. So let's look at the triggers first. Triggers are the first step that you can add to any workflow in n8n. They are what starts a workflow. And if you look at the Notion app, there are two native triggers available. One is on page added to a database, and another one is on page updated in a database. And you can see that these are polling triggers that check the database every minute, every hour, or you can determine how often. Although recently Notion also released workspace webhooks, so you can actually get data immediately if you use a custom API call currently. So when you set up this kind of trigger, you can set what event you want, if it is a page added or updated in a database, and then select your connection here. If you haven't established it yet, you will need to create a connection, add the integration to the Notion pages or databases that you want to use. That's very important. I made a whole video about that you can watch to learn more about it. And once you've given access to the connection to the pages and databases that you need, you will then find that database here. And you can select the database that you want to monitor for changes. And then you can toggle this on, simplify. Usually I toggle this off. Simplify just simplifies the data structure of the payload that you receive whenever this trigger fires. Personally, I don't find that very useful. I want all the data and then decide what to do with it. So I toggle it off. If you look at the API documentation here, you will find under the databases endpoints, there is query a database. And this is essentially what we are using in these nodes. We are querying a database, and then n8n handles the logic to sort pages by created time or by updated time, and based on that it returns the most recent results. Now, because there are webhooks that were released in the past in Notion automations or buttons, and now also workspace level webhooks that send specific events to your webhook trigger or automation instantly from Notion, you can also set up webhooks by yourself, and for that you can use the webhook trigger. You will then get a URL, which you can also customize here. You will select post as the HTTP method, and you can also set authentication if needed. Usually it's not needed because that is handled by the integration in Notion. And then you can send your request to this URL, whether it be from a Notion database automation, from a Notion button in a database, a Notion button on a page, or from workspace level webhook requests that are sent from specific events that you subscribe to. I made videos about webhooks in Notion, so you can check them out separately to learn more exactly what this means and how this works in practice. Now let's look at the action steps or nodes. In here, if I type Notion, okay, there are 14 actions available natively. There are some block actions, database actions, page actions, and user actions. So blocks in Notion are anything on a page. It might be a text block, a callout, inline database, a simple table, an image, a quote. So anything that's on Notion page is a block. And so block actions allow you to modify blocks on a Notion page. And in particular, you can do two things in here. You can append a block. This means that it will add a new block at the bottom of the page where you're using this. So to configure this node, you would select append after, and then you would select the specific block that you want to append after. And this usually is the page, which you can also set by ID. You can get the ID of a page in the URL of that page between the / characters, and you can paste it here manually if you know that always the same page will be updated, or very likely that page will be dynamic over time. So you might want to have a previous node, maybe that creates a new page, and then have these nodes that appends new content to that page at the very bottom of that page. So in this case, if you map it dynamically, then you would use the expression and then map it from a previous node accordingly. You can then append also multiple blocks in here at the same time with one request. And you can see here all the block types available. There's paragraph, you can add headings, toggles, to-dos, bullet list items, images. And it looks like that's not a very comprehensive list of all the available blocks in the Notion API. So if you need more customization, then currently in n8n, you will need to use an HTTP node and make your own API request following the documentation. And the block endpoints are available here under blocks. Append block children is this node that we're looking at. That's the endpoint that n8n uses for this node. And you can see how to set this up here in the example JavaScript or shell. Here you get the URL that you would need to use if you were to use the HTTP node, the HTTP method, which is patch in this case, and then you know what parameters you need to pass. And you know, for example, that one path parameter that's required is the block ID. And that's why here we have this ID that we need to insert. And then we know that in the body, we need to pass children, and then after that's optional, but children is required. Children is a string of the specific blocks that you want to append. So that's what we do here. You can see that the blocks that you want to append, then we select them. And n8n essentially creates that children array in the background for you via this drag and drop, what you see is what you get editor. So you just need to manually set these values, and then n8n creates the payload for you. You can see here all the available block types that we can append. And so you can tell that in n8n that is not really all of these block types supported yet. So you might need customization if needed. And I find that this is very useful because you can see exactly what an example request looks like. And so you can just copy paste this body of the request in the HTTP node if you were to use it, and then just replace the objects, type, and the actual values with your own values. They might be mapped from previous node, they might be manual, or anything in between. So the other block-based action in n8n is get child blocks. And in the API, this is retrieve block children. So what this does is you pass an ID of a block. It might be a page if you want to get all the blocks within the page, or it might be a parent block, for example, a toggle that has children within it. And if you query the child blocks of that toggle by passing the ID of that toggle block, then you will get all the children in the result, as long as you toggle this on return all. And you can also fetch nested block automatically, so you don't need to iterate over them many times, because sometimes in Notion you can have nested blocks. And if you do not allow this option, then n8n only returns the first nesting level. But if there are additional nesting levels, you need to loop through the items and iterate through them. But if you turn this on, then all the nested blocks are also returned in the response, which is very helpful to process everything at once. The next type of n8n actions in Notion are database-based actions. And in the operations, you can see we can get database, we can get many databases, or we can search databases using text search. So if we get a database, then we can select what database you want to get. This returns the structural database, meaning all the properties, their IDs, and their property types. So this can be helpful if you want to make sure that you keep your integration in sync with database changes, or if you need to use the IDs of properties in your integration to ensure that it is robust. And if you change the name of a property in Notion, your integration doesn't break. So that's an example use case here. And as per usual, because that's an input variable in the n8n node, you can either select it manually from here, or you can map it from previous nodes. You can see here in the Notion documentation, if you go to databases, you can find all the available database endpoints, and retrieve a database is what we just looked at, or we pass the database ID and we get the response. You can see here how to get a database ID and where to find it. If you want to get many databases, then we can select how many we want to get. We can also return all, and this gets either all the databases in our Notion workspace where the integration, so the connection that you had here, has access to, so keep that in mind. Or you can set a limit and then return only some databases. And if you want to search a database, then you can search here. You can input the search text in here, and this corresponds to querying a database. And this corresponds to the search by title endpoint, where, as you can see, you can search any database for specific keywords, and there's the text that you would input here. You can see here there are additional parameters that you can set. You can sort, for example, descending, last edited time, or ascending, and if we sort the results based on that. When we look at the database page resources in n8n, here are the operations available. You can create a page in a database. So this is pretty straightforward. You create a new page in a database. You will then select database, set the title, and then you can set all the properties, and you can also append page content to that new page directly from here with one single request. So that's very useful and powerful. You can also set the icons. Be aware that first you need to select database in order to see the properties loading here. In this case, I can't see them because I didn't select any database. But if I were to select a database, and as per usual, because that's a variable, you can have it fixed or as an expression mapped from previous nodes. So if I look at this one here, and then select the properties, and this is what it looks like. So I would select one property at a time and then set the value either fixed or as an expression. And this corresponds to create a page. So if you were to use the HTTP node, then this is the endpoint that you use. And then you see here the data or the body of the request that we need. The database ID, we can add the icon, that's optional. The cover, that's optional. And then we need the properties. And in particular, the title property will always be required because that's required in Notion. If we get a page in database, we can specify what page you want to get by mapping the ID or URL of that page in the n8n node. And this will return that page, all the properties of that page. So you can use that data in subsequent nodes. If you get many pages, you are essentially querying a database. So if you go to databases in the API documentation, you would query a database. And that's what that corresponds to. So that's why you can select database here. You can set the limit, and then you can set a filter, which you can build manually or build through JSON. So you can provide a filter that looks like this here with or and rules nested within each other. You can specify the property name, what property type that is, and what it needs to equal to for your filter to return the correct results that you want. You can then also sort by specific properties in a specific direction. If you update the page in a database, that's similar to page creation. In this case, you can just update the properties of a page. So here we're talking about database pages. And so you can select what property you want and what value do you want to place in that property. And that will update that database page with the new value. And that corresponds to pages, update page properties. You can do similar things with the page resource in n8n. So in here, you can create a page. In this case, this page is not part of a database. So that's why you won't see any properties here, but just blocks. You can append blocks to that page in this single request, or you can just create the page with an empty body. So the title will be required, and then you can append blocks. Then you have the options with the icon and the icon type. If you archive a page, that ends up in the trash in Notion, which is at the bottom left corner of your sidebar menu. And that means that it stays in the trash for 30 days. So you can recover it if you like. And then you can search pages. So this is the search endpoint here. Search by title, or you can specify the search text. It searches through all the pages. Finally, you can work with users, and in Notion API, only members are supported, meaning that if you query users, so if you want to get a user, you can get both members, these are the paid people in your workspace, and guests, these are the free people in your workspace. As long as you pass the user ID, then you can get that user data, including email, name, user ID, type, which might be person or bot, and maybe some other things. And if you get many users, then you can return all people in your workspace. And this returns only members, paid members in your workspace. So be aware of that. So if you want to work with guests, for example, by automatically assigning them to a task in your n8n workflow, you will need to first make sure that you know the ID of that person in some capacity, either by having a separate table that stores the user IDs and then querying that table, or by manually hard coding it in the workflow, because guests can only be queried if you pass the ID of that person. But if you get many users, then only members are returned by the Notion API. So you can see here the users endpoint, where you can list all users. This corresponds to get many in n8n, or you can retrieve a user, which is the get n8n node. And this should conclude the overview of the Notion nodes here. In n8n, we saw the database actions, we saw the database page actions, the page actions, the user actions. And so you will see that some nodes are missing. If you look at the API endpoint, and we look at blocks, for example, if you want to update a block, you will need to use an HTTP node and then set up everything that you need. So that looks like this. You type HTTP, that's not in Notion, so I'm going to go here, HTTP request. And then I will set the method, which I can find here in the documentation. For example, in this case, it would be patch. So I would select patch from here. The URL, I would copy from the documentation here. If there is a variable like this with curly brackets, then I would replace it in n8n with the actual value that I need. So in here, for block ID, maybe I want to map it from a previous node. So I want to do expression. And then in here, I would drag and drop whatever I have there to make sure that this works properly. And then because you're using Notion API, you will need authentication, and n8n makes it very easy because you can select a predefined credential, and then in here you can select the Notion API and you can select what connection you want to establish, and that's it. So you don't need to handle that yourself, and n8n can handle it for you. So that's very easy. And once that is done, then you need to follow the documentation specs to understand what exactly you need to pass as parameters that are required or optional, and to pass in the body of the request that is required or optional. So you can send query parameters here, include the name, that's the key, and the value that you want to pass. And you can add as many as you like. Then you can send the body of the request. You can select the format. In Notion, it is JSON. So you can always use JSON. And you can either go raw by creating the JSON just like this, or you can build it manually, field by field, where you input the name and the value. So in this case, for example, if I want to have this, I would do object, and then value would be block. And I would add another parameter, and then so on. So this is the name, and then we got the value there. So you will need to understand a bit exactly what the body of the request needs to look like, and then break it down and add all the names and all the values for each parameter. That constructs a JSON. Then you want to test, see if it doesn't work, check, refine, test again, and then refine it, and then test and refine until you achieve what it is that you envision. So there's also a nice flexible option in n8n using HTTP requests where the authentication is handled for you. And you can also see that, for example, there are no native comment endpoints in n8n available. So for that, you will also need to use the HTTP node in n8n. That's it for now. Let me know your questions in the comments below, or reach out to me following the link in the description. For now, thanks for watching, and see you soon.